humanity had always been the quiet observer of the galaxy. Nestled within its corner of the cosmos, Earth had remained largely undisturbed, a small speck in a vast universe of intergalactic conflict. For centuries, humans had studied the stars, but had chosen not to intervene, a decision forged from the remnants of a war that nearly obliterated them. Long ago, humanity had encountered an ancient and powerful empire, the Vraxian Dominion, that almost erased them from the history books. The conflict was swift, brutal, and one-sided, with humanity's primitive technologies and limited understanding of galactic politics rendering them powerless against the onslaught. After that, Earth retreated, unwilling to make the same mistake again. Humans learned to live in silence, observing from the shadows. Despite this, humanity's nature had not changed. It had always been a species that thrived on curiosity, innovation, and most importantly, resilience. In the years following the Vraxian War, Earth's survivors had rebuilt their societies, advancing their technologies in secret. Military secrets, once considered a weakness, were now being studied and improved upon, but only in the most discreet of ways. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity was nothing more than a faint signal, an inconsequential species too weak to be of any real importance. The universe had moved on, busy with its own empires, wars, and political struggles. Earth's name was not even a footnote in the galactic records. Yet, despite the cautious silence that defined humanity's place in the stars, the universe was about to make a critical mistake. A new threat was on the rise, one far more aggressive and dangerous than the Vraxians. The Zorth Alliance was an interstellar federation of warlords, a coalition of ruthless species united by one goal: to dominate the galaxy. The Zorth were known for their technological superiority and militaristic tactics, having conquered hundreds of systems, subjugating entire species in their wake. Their fleets were vast, their weapons sophisticated, and their ambition boundless. For the Zorth, there were no borders, no treaties, and no compromises. If you weren't with them, you were against them, and Earth had been silently marked as the next target. The Zorth's invasion was swift and relentless. Initially, they targeted the neighboring star systems, crushing any resistance in their path. Their strategy was simple: overpower and assimilate. The larger galactic powers, content with their own borders, underestimated the Zorth's reach and ambition. But the Zorth's eyes were fixed on Earth now, believing that this small, insignificant planet would fall easily. What they failed to realize was that humanity had long since anticipated this moment. The decision to stay quiet for centuries was not born out of fear, but strategy. Captain Alice Sterling stood at the helm of the humanity's defense. Once a diplomat, now a seasoned strategist, she was not a figure of brute force, but one of intellect, observation, and subtlety. She was the one who had guided Earth's covert operations, ensuring that humanity's technological advancements remained hidden from the prying eyes of the galaxy. She was well aware that any confrontation with the Zorth would need to be calculated, measured, and precise. There was no room for mistakes. The fate of her people rested in the delicate balance between diplomacy and war, a game she had been preparing for since her youth. Captain Sterling had spent years watching the stars, tracking the rise of the Zorth. She had seen their conquests, their brutality, and their unchecked desire to expand. But she also understood something that most of the galaxy did not: the Zorth's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They were arrogant. They underestimated every species they encountered, assuming their military might would be enough to crush any opposition. And so, when it came time for humanity to make its move, she knew the one thing the Zorth would never anticipate was humility, the quiet, calm, and civil way humanity would make its presence known. In a brief moment of clarity, Captain Sterling had composed the message that would be humanity's first, and potentially only, warning. She had taken the necessary time to craft every word, knowing that tone was as important as content. The Zorth would find it hard to take humans seriously, considering the disparity in power, yet this very form of diplomacy was humanity's greatest weapon. The message was simple, almost polite, yet beneath its words lay a promise of unimaginable consequences should the Zorth choose to ignore it. She authorized its transmission, knowing it might very well be their last chance at peace. The message read. Asterisk to the Zorth Alliance, we respectfully request that you reconsider your course of action. If you continue this aggressive expansion, the consequences will be severe. This is your only warning. Proceed at your own risk. Asterisk. It was a calm and measured message, meant to evoke no anger, only a quiet threat. The Zorth would not expect it, and that was exactly why it was so powerful. There was no bombast, no arrogance, no desperate cries for help. It was simply a statement of fact, a polite request to stop. The kind of message that would be easily dismissed, laughed off, or ignored. And it was precisely this dismissal that would lead to the Zorth's undoing. Captain Sterling knew that the Zorth would not take the message seriously. In fact, she expected them to mock it. After all, they had been able to crush entire civilizations with brute force and overwhelming firepower. How could a species that had never once truly fought back ever stand up to their might? That was exactly the point. The Zorth would underestimate humanity, dismiss its threat, and continue their march towards Earth with confidence. But beneath the surface, humanity had spent centuries preparing. Not with the goal of creating a superior military, but with the understanding that true power lay in something far more subtle: psychological warfare, strategic deception, and unpredictability. Humanity's greatest advantage was not its ships or weapons, but its mind. Humanity could think several moves ahead, anticipate, adapt, and outsmart its enemies. And that was precisely what Captain Sterling had prepared for. As the message was sent, she knew the Zorth would scoff, yet she was already preparing for the next phase of their response. Her team was already working on disrupting Zorth communications, confusing their military leadership, and spreading misinformation to undermine their confidence. Humanity's strengths, long overlooked, were about to become their greatest weapon. For the first time in centuries, humanity was no longer silent. They had made their move. The Zorth, confident in their impending victory, would soon discover that their greatest mistake was underestimating the quiet, humble species they had dismissed so easily. This was not a war of force, but of minds, and the universe was about to learn the true power of humanity's subtlety. The Zorth Alliance, infamous for their military might and overwhelming technology, were not accustomed to being challenged. Their vast armadas crushed all resistance, and their strategy was simple: subjugate or annihilate. As the human message flashed across their vast communications network, it was initially met with disdain. The Zorth, sitting in their colossal warships and imperial citadels, believed themselves to be untouchable. Who were the humans, a species they had never truly engaged with, to send them a polite warning? It seemed almost laughable. A quick glance at Earth's history, a brief period of military conflict and occasional skirmishes, was enough to convince the Zorth leaders that they had nothing to fear. Humanity had no record of large-scale space exploration or warfare. They were just a small, relatively insignificant species lost in the vastness of the galaxy. Their message, so civil and unthreatening, was exactly what the Zorth had expected: a futile gesture of weakness from a species too afraid to confront them directly. They dismissed the warning without a second thought. But beneath this arrogance lay a fatal flaw: their complete inability to understand the true nature of humanity. The Zorth, with their superiority complex and reliance on brute force, were blind to the subtlety and cunning that humans had mastered over centuries. Their mistake wasn't just in dismissing the human message, it was in failing to see the power in what they had ignored for so long: human restraint, diplomacy, and patience. Captain Alice Sterling had anticipated their reaction. She knew the Zorth would laugh, scoff, and dismiss the human warning as the bluff of a weaker species. That was part of the plan. It was exactly what humanity needed them to do. The Zorth were blinded by their own sense of invulnerability, and they would walk right into humanity's trap. They would never expect what came next. Within hours of the Zorth's dismissal, Sterling's fleet activated the first phase of their strategy. Humanity had spent decades stockpiling advanced, yet untraceable technologies, old human prototypes from ancient wars and recovered alien relics, now hidden within the core of Earth's military infrastructure. These were not just weapons, they were tools of psychological warfare. The Zorth had made the grave error of assuming that humanity's silence was born of fear, not intelligence. What they failed to realize was that humanity's silence was the perfect disguise for a weapon far more dangerous than their advanced fleets: unpredictability. The first sign of humanity's retaliation came not in the form of missiles or massive fleets, but rather in the form of communication. Earth's response was once again polite and civil. A simple message was broadcast to every Zorth military commander and warlord, delivered not with threats or anger, but with an eerie calm. Asterisk, you were warned. It's no longer our fault. Asterisk. This message was brief, and it was meant to confuse. It was designed to provoke uncertainty and self-doubt in the minds of the Zorth military leadership. If there was one thing the Zorth prided themselves on, it was their control and order. Chaos was their enemy. And humanity, with its carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation, had just unleashed a flood of confusion that rippled through the entire Zorth command structure. While the Zorth military scrambled to understand the meaning of the message, the human fleet began to execute their next phase of the operation. Through hidden subspace channels, humanity's most advanced ships activated cloaking technology and began positioning themselves at key strategic points near Zorth supply lines. These ships were not designed for direct combat but for disruption. They planted false signals and scrambled the Zorth's highly sophisticated communication systems, causing delays, confusion, and most importantly, a deep sense of frustration. The Zorth, normally the aggressors, were now beginning to feel the uncertainty of war for the first time. Captain Sterling understood that the battle was not going to be won in the traditional sense. Humanity's strength lay in their ability to turn the Zorth's own systems against them, to create doubt and panic where there was once certainty. And so, they continued. Messages, broadcasts, and signals, each one carefully crafted to undermine the Zorth's morale, were sent. For every victory the Zorth achieved on the battlefield, they were countered by a subtle, unseen blow to their reputation and their military efficiency. The Zorth's warlords began to argue with each other, each one blaming the other for the failures that had begun to mount. Their communication networks, once flawless, now became riddled with error and misdirection. As the days passed, the human influence grew. Captain Sterling's fleet, small in comparison to the Zorth's vast armadas, was wreaking havoc. While the Zorth focused on fighting battles, humanity was winning the war. Every Zorth fleet encountered a growing sense of confusion, their communications disrupted, their orders delayed, and their strategies compromised. The more the Zorth pushed forward, the more they found themselves bogged down in a web of disinformation and confusion. The Zorth, initially confident in their technological superiority, began to realize they were no longer in control. Their military leaders, once unshakable, were becoming increasingly paranoid. How could they have miscalculated so badly? How could a species so seemingly insignificant have orchestrated such a delicate and complex campaign of psychological warfare? Yet, this was precisely what Captain Sterling had planned. Humanity's strength was never in numbers or firepower, it was in the ability to think outside the box, to adapt, and to fight a battle of attrition that the Zorth were unprepared for. The Zorth relied on their strength to intimidate, their sheer force to control, but humanity had no such arrogance. Humanity's strength lay in cunning, the ability to anticipate and outthink the enemy, to use their own overconfidence as a weapon against them. It was at this point that the Zorth began to take humanity's warning seriously, but it was already too late. Their fleet's operations had stalled. Their command structures were collapsing under the weight of their own confusion. The galaxy, once sure that humanity was too weak to resist, was now beginning to realize that the polite warning sent to the Zorth had been far more than just a diplomatic gesture. It was the prelude to their downfall. And as Captain Sterling watched the tide of battle shift in humanity's favor, she knew the Zorth had made their fatal mistake. They had underestimated the quiet, methodical species they had dismissed as weak and insignificant. Humanity's warning had been polite, yes. But it was also their final chance. The Zorth had ignored it. And now, they were paying the price. As the Zorth Alliance scrambled to recover from their initial failures, the damage to their pride and military infrastructure was undeniable. At first, they dismissed the human strikes as insignificant annoyances, minor disruptions that would eventually be corrected. But as time went on, the situation became impossible to ignore. Their systems, once flawless and unassailable, were now plagued by breakdowns. Their highly sophisticated fleets, designed to be the pinnacle of military might, had encountered an enemy they couldn't quantify or predict. They had underestimated humanity's ingenuity, and now, the full weight of their miscalculations was sinking in. The Zorth's leadership, once unified and confident, fractured into factions. High-ranking generals, once certain of their inevitable victory, began pointing fingers at one another. The delicate political balance within the Zorth government began to fray as whispers of failure spread throughout the ranks. Their arrogance, which had once made them the most feared empire in the galaxy, was now their greatest vulnerability. The Zorth couldn't comprehend how a species they considered beneath them had outwitted them so thoroughly. They had always relied on their overwhelming technological advantages, assuming that brute force was enough to subjugate any civilization. Humanity, however, had no such illusions. Captain Sterling's fleet, though small in numbers compared to the Zorth, had become a persistent thorn in their side. Every encounter with the humans' guerrilla tactics further shattered the Zorth's sense of superiority. The Zorth, accustomed to imposing their will through overwhelming firepower, were now facing an enemy who was adept at exploiting their every weakness. The very technologies the Zorth relied upon, those that had once ensured their dominance, were being turned against them. Humanity's strategy was simple yet devastating. While the Zorth focused on conventional warfare, humanity deployed a far more insidious form of combat, psychological warfare. Every time the Zorth encountered a human fleet, they were forced to confront not just their enemies but also their own doubt and confusion. Humanity, through carefully coordinated disinformation campaigns, had begun to fracture the Zorth's morale. The Zorth military, once a monolithic force, now found itself in disarray. Their soldiers began questioning their leaders, unsure of whether the battle could still be won. What was once a well-oiled machine was now a bloated bureaucracy, stifled by paranoia and infighting. At the same time, Captain Sterling continued her campaign of subtle but relentless disruption. While the Zorth remained focused on traditional warfare, humanity's tactics took a different approach. Ships equipped with cloaking devices, once thought to be a relic of Earth's early space exploration, were now capable of slipping past the Zorth's formidable detection systems. These ships harassed Zorth supply lines, sowing chaos in their rear guard. The humans were never fully seen, they struck from the shadows, creating confusion in their wake. Entire fleets of Zorth vessels were rendered useless by the simple but effective tactic of cutting off their resupply routes, leaving them stranded in the far reaches of space. The Zorth, unprepared for such guerrilla tactics, found themselves caught in a war of attrition they couldn't win. The psychological impact of these strikes was far more damaging than the loss of ships or resources. The Zorth, a species that prided itself on military discipline, began to crumble under the pressure. The constant disruption, the inability to communicate with certainty, and the mounting losses began to create cracks in their once unified front. Desperation set in. The Zorth leaders tried to rally their forces, but the damage had already been done. Morale plummeted. Soldiers, who had once been proud of their invincibility, now whispered doubts among themselves. They had become pawns in a game they didn't understand, and their leaders had no answers. Meanwhile, humanity's quiet campaign continued. Captain Sterling and her crew remained invisible to the Zorth, carefully orchestrating their next moves. They understood that it wasn't about overwhelming firepower, it was about exploiting the Zorth's overconfidence and their reliance on predictable tactics. Humanity didn't need to match the Zorth in numbers, they only needed to disrupt their enemy's sense of order, making the Zorth question their own superiority. And in doing so, humanity had begun to turn the tide of the war. As the weeks turned into months, the Zorth's power continued to wane. The galaxy, once certain of the Zorth's eventual victory, now watched as their empire began to crumble. Messages from Zorth military commanders grew increasingly desperate, their reports filled with confusion and dismay. The Alliance's once mighty fleets were now scattered and ineffective, their power fading in the face of humanity's unexpected and relentless tactics. What had started as a polite warning was now an existential threat to the Zorth. They had ignored humanity's message, and now they were paying the price. The diplomatic finesse of Captain Sterling, once seen as mere politeness, had turned into a deadly weapon. The Zorth, by now, were starting to panic. Their leadership, once united by their belief in their own superiority, now faced internal divisions. Some of the most senior generals advocated for peace, urging their leaders to reconsider their stance, but their calls were drowned out by those who still clung to the idea of total domination. As internal dissent spread, so did the chaos within the Zorth ranks. The very unity that had once made them such a formidable force now seemed like a distant memory. And yet, humanity remained calm, collected, and patient. Captain Sterling's message had been clear: this was the last chance for peace. The Zorth's failure to heed that warning had set in motion a chain of events that could no longer be undone. Humanity, once a passive observer in the galaxy, had become the unexpected force that would reshape the balance of power. The Zorth had underestimated humanity's resolve, their ingenuity, and their ability to strike where it hurt the most, at the heart of their confidence. As the Zorth began to realize that they had made a grave error, their arrogance turned to fear. They had misjudged humanity in every conceivable way. What they had dismissed as a polite request had been the final warning. And now, they were on the brink of losing everything. The universe, watching from the sidelines, had learned a harsh lesson: humanity was not a species to be underestimated. The Zorth Alliance would soon be no more, a casualty of their own pride and their failure to recognize the quiet power of humanity. For Captain Sterling and her fleet, victory was within reach. It had never been about brute force or overwhelming firepower. It had been about patience, strategy, and the quiet, unshakable resolve of a species that had been underestimated for far too long. The Zorth, once the most feared empire in the galaxy, had learned too late that humanity's polite warning was not a mere formality, it was a declaration of war, and their last chance for peace. The final days of the Zorth Alliance were marked by a growing sense of panic. Their empire, once a symbol of military superiority, was rapidly collapsing under the weight of humanity's persistent and unpredictable tactics. It wasn't just the failed military campaigns or the loss of ships and resources that were damaging, the deeper wound was psychological. The Zorth, a species known for their rigid discipline and confidence in their own superiority, had been outwitted by an enemy they considered inferior. The humbling realization of this failure spread like wildfire through the Zorth ranks, fracturing the unity that had once been their greatest strength. The leaders of the Zorth Alliance, once resolute in their goal of galactic domination, now found themselves at odds. Internal strife erupted as their most prominent military commanders were forced to face the consequences of their disastrous decisions. Some called for negotiations, desperate to stop the bleeding before it was too late, while others insisted on total annihilation of humanity, refusing to accept the crushing reality that the humans had outplayed them. The once unified Zorth government splintered, with factions vying for power in the wake of their looming defeat. Their empire, once the most feared and advanced in the galaxy, was now crumbling, their leaders unable to unite under a single vision for survival. But amidst the chaos, Captain Alice Sterling and her fleet remained undeterred. Humanity's victory had never relied on overwhelming force. It was never about matching the Zorth in numbers or firepower. It had always been about exploiting their weaknesses, about turning their arrogance and overconfidence into their undoing. Sterling's calm, measured approach had set the stage for this moment. Humanity's strategy, based on unpredictability, precision, and psychological warfare, had proven devastating to the Zorth. Each strike, though subtle, had been calculated to destabilize their enemy's core beliefs. The Zorth had believed that their superior technology and military dominance would guarantee their victory, but in the face of human ingenuity, those advantages had become irrelevant. The final blow to the Zorth's empire came not in the form of a grand battle, but rather through a series of coordinated strikes that crippled their ability to function as a cohesive force. Humanity, having spent centuries quietly building their technological and strategic capabilities, now unleashed the full scope of their resources in ways the Zorth had never anticipated. Captain Sterling's fleet, though small, had access to technologies that the Zorth considered obsolete, ancient human warships and long-forgotten weapons, each one a surprise for the Zorth, each one tailored to exploit their vulnerabilities. What had begun as isolated skirmishes escalated into full-scale engagements, and as the Zorth fleets began to crumble, their once feared commanders found themselves scrambling to protect their remaining assets. But it was too late. Humanity had already won the war. The Zorth, unable to adjust to the new kind of warfare they were facing, had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Sterling's message, once a polite request, had become a death sentence for their empire. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the Zorth alliance, once an unstoppable force, disintegrated before their eyes. In the wake of their collapse, there were no grand celebrations or fanfares, just the quiet triumph of humanity, whose name would now be spoken with awe and respect across the stars. It wasn't a victory marked by the destruction of entire planets or the obliteration of fleets. It was a victory of intellect, of strategy, of patience. Humanity had not only survived, they had triumphed against an empire that had deemed them unworthy of notice. In the aftermath, the surviving Zorth leaders, their empire in ruins, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Humanity had given them a warning, and they had ignored it. The politeness, the calm tone, the seemingly simple message, they had all been part of a carefully crafted plan. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their military might, it was their ability to think outside the box, to approach warfare not with brute force but with subtlety and precision. The Zorth had been caught off guard by the sheer creativity and unpredictability of humanity's response. In the days following the final battle, the leaders of the surviving galactic empires, those who had once looked down on humanity, began to reconsider their stance. The lesson had been learned, albeit too late. They now understood that humanity was not a species to be ignored or underestimated. They had seen firsthand what happened when the human race was provoked. Captain Sterling's message had been clear and concise, but the message had resonated far beyond the confines of that single diplomatic request. It had become a universal lesson: never assume that those who stay silent are weak. The diplomatic landscape of the galaxy shifted as a result. The Zorth alliance, though once a powerful force, was now a shadow of its former self. Humanity, having avoided direct conflict for so long, had emerged as a dominant force on the galactic stage, their quiet influence felt in every corner of the universe. Though they had been on the sidelines for centuries, humanity had proven that they were more than capable of holding their own in a galaxy filled with powerful empires and ancient species. As the Zorth leaders were forced into exile and the remnants of their fleets scattered across the galaxy, Captain Sterling and her fleet took their place in the history books. Their message, once a polite warning, had become the catalyst for a new era of intergalactic diplomacy. No longer would humanity be seen as insignificant. They were a force to be reckoned with. The message was clear for all to hear: humanity's politeness was never a weakness. It had always been their greatest strength, and in the end, it was that strength, born of intelligence, resourcefulness, and patience, that had delivered them to victory, securing their place among the stars. The Zorth had learned too late that underestimating humanity would be their final mistake. And for the galaxy, the lesson was an unforgettable one: never, ever take the quiet species at their word.